The act of making a choice, it feels pretty simple. You think about doing something, you decide to do it, and then you act. It's one of the most basic parts of being human. But what if we looked at that process very, very closely? If we could measure it with scientific precision, where would we find the exact moment a decision actually begins? The common assumption, the one we all live by, it's pretty straightforward. A conscious thought gives the command, and then our body follows through. The sequence just seems obvious. But let's take a look at a famous experiment that put this very sequence to the test. An experiment that really asks if our gut feeling about how we act lines up with what's actually happening in our brains. So we're going to examine the experiment by neuroscientist Benjamin Libet. It was designed for one specific purpose: to measure the precise timing of a voluntary action. The goal here wasn't philosophical, it was purely about measurement. It was a timing problem. The whole idea was to put 3 key events onto a single timeline: when the brain's activity starts, when a person feels they've consciously decided, and finally, when the action happens. The setup itself was very direct. A person was told to just flex their finger, but only at a moment of their own choosing. No one told them when. They just had to act whenever they felt that spontaneous urge. And when they did feel it, they had to report the exact time using a special clock. The whole time, their brain activity was being monitored. Now, the key signal the scientists were looking for is something called the readiness potential. All you need to know is that it's a very specific pattern of brain activity that builds up right before a person makes a voluntary movement. It's basically a physical sign that the brain is getting ready to act. So when Libet and his team took all the data and mapped out the events, well, the timeline they created presented a direct challenge to that common assumption we talked about. Here's what they found. First, the data showed that about 500 milliseconds, that's half a second, before the finger actually moved, that readiness potential began. The brain was already preparing for the action. Then came the participants' reports of when they felt the decision. On average, they reported being consciously aware of their choice to move at around 200 milliseconds before the action. So, the brain's preparation had already started a full 300 milliseconds before the person felt like they had even made a choice. The complete sequence then looked like this. First, the brain's readiness potential begins. Then, conscious awareness of the decision follows. And finally, the movement itself happens. The direct conclusion from this data is simple and clear. The brain initiates the process for a voluntary action before the individual has any conscious experience of having decided to do it. The implication here is measured, but it's pretty significant. That feeling we get of deciding, it might not actually be the starting gun. Instead, it could just be our awareness catching up to an unconscious process that was already in motion. As you can imagine, this result has led to decades of discussion, but it's really important to understand the nuance here, including how the experiment's own author interpreted it. See, Libet himself didn't jump to the conclusion that free will is just an illusion. He actually proposed that our consciousness still has a very important job to do, even if it isn't starting the action. He came up with this idea of a conscious veto. The theory goes that even though the urge to act might come from unconscious brain activity, there's still a small window of time, maybe 150 milliseconds or so, where our conscious mind can step in and stop the action. To just say no. He called it free won't instead of free will. And that leaves us with the central question this experiment forces us to ask, a question that is still debated today. If your brain starts the process of a decision before you're even aware of it, then what is the actual role of your conscious self?